Well, glad to see you could make it to class on time. Nothing more disturbing than having a student show up late. Uh, anyway, today we're going to talk about nutrition history and look at how progression has taken place in the knowledge of nutrition throughout the last couple centuries, anyway. But first, I thought I would look at your future. I know a lot of you are going into healthcare, and but it doesn't really matter when you get out of college and you go to get a job. You're going to have to write a resume. So I thought I would help you and read some of the 50 funniest resume mistakes, bloopers, and blunders ever. Um, the caption reads, "People write the strangest things on their resume, sometimes downright hysterical. Why should only recruiting manager get to laugh at these? Here are the top 10. Now, I'm not going to read the top 10, but we're going to read some that I've selected. So let's look at this and think about when you're writing your resume, these are things you would not want to put on your resume. Okay. Service for old men to check if they are still alive or not. Okay. 2001 summer voluntary work for taking care of the elderly and vegetable people. Okay. I'm about to enroll on a business and finance degree with Open University. I feel that this qualification will prove detrimental to me for future success. Don't write that. Okay, another thing you don't want to send with your resume. A candidate included a candidate included a letter from his mother. Don't do that. Skills, strong work ethic, attention to detail, team player, self-motivated, attention to detail. Not what I want in a nurse. Again, they have two attention to details in their sentence. Woman who sent her resume and cover letter without deleting someone else's editing, including such comments as, "I don't think you want to say this about yourself here." Okay. My sister-in-law misspelled the word proofreading in her skill set. A candidate listed her email address as pornstardelight at blank blank blank.com. Okay, my duties included cleaning the restrooms and seating customers. That had to be an interesting job. Okay, here's this for you pre-nursing individuals. One applicant for a nursing position noted that she didn't like dealing with blood or needles. Not something you'd want to put on a resume for a nurse. Okay. Anyway, onward and upward. Okay, what we're going to do in this session is look at the nutrition and look at its past and where we are today. In the past, before before about the 1700s, around in there, they really didn't know that foods had nutrients in them. It didn't really uh, come to the thought process that there was something in foods that could influence health or influence disease. A lot of the thinking was that if you were sick, you must have done something wrong, and that the gods were punishing you, or something was wrong. And obviously, the rich people, they were doing everything right, and the poor people were doing everything wrong. But then, as time went along, there was some people who were very observant, and they pretty much started noticing that, look at that, there is a difference in the foods that people eat, and it seems like the foods that the poor people eat, they get sick more and they die more, and that kind of thing. And the thought process started turning to, gee, I wonder if there is something in food that possibly they're not getting. So it kind of came to that. And you can see this flyer for an article, I guess, in 1651 about rickets. And the things that look like F's are S's, so disease, common children. That's kind of strange, but anyway. But you know, a lot of the information in this article basically had nothing to do really with food, and had a lot to do with lifestyle and that kind of thing. So anyway, as we go on, though, I do want you to know these eras as we go through. We'll go through 4 eras, and I do want you to know the dates of these eras. Now, as we go through and look at different other dates or specific dates within the eras, I don't really expect you to remember those. I expect you to remember the highlights of the eras, but not necessarily the dates. But I do want you to know that the Discovery era basically ended in about 1939. But the first, looking at this, because you've had some science background, you know scientific method, and you know that there needs to be some kind of research done before you come to some kind of a conclusion. Well, the first known controlled dietary study started in about 1774. And it was done by a person named James Lind, who was looking at sailors who were getting sick. They would be fine for about the first 2-3 months or so. Then they would start falling ill, and they didn't know what was happening, and some of them starting to die. So in the 1770s, the government of England, I guess the Queen of England, hired James Lind to go out. He was a physician, to go out on the boats with these English sailors and to look and see if he could figure out what was going on. And so he went out on the boat, and sure enough, 2 or 3 months later, these sailors started getting sick, and so he did some experiments on them, and the bedridden ones, some he gave just water. I guess that was his control. And he gave some vinegar. He gave some wine. And then others he gave citrus. Got some juice from citrus and gave them citrus. And sure enough, the individuals who got the citrus got better. And so through that study, and this was actually the first controlled human dietary study that was known, was done so that he actually had a control, and he actually came up with this idea. Well, this is why you now see sailors called limeys, because he basically discovered that scurvy was a lack of something. They didn't really know that it was vitamin C, but he was the first one that kind of proved that there was something in foods that could make a difference in individuals' health. So that's really the first controlled study that linked nutrients in food to disease. Then as we go through and kind of progress, chemistry was pretty good in the early 1800s, and back in the 1830s they discovered that foods had proteins and carbs and lipids, and they were to look at that. In 1906 they actually discovered that there were organic factors in food, or they looked at there were different types of things in foods that they called organic factors, and they actually called them vital amines. And as you know, if you've had any chemistry at all, an amine has a nitrogen group. Well, these organic factors really didn't have nitrogen groups, and so in about after they found these organic factors, they had been using vital amines for so long that they actually changed their name when they discovered they weren't amines to vitamin. So vitamin comes from vital amines, and they coined that phrase in about 1912. So that's where the name vitamin kind of comes from. Then in the 1930s, basically by 1939, all of the essential nutrients are known. So all of the vitamins were known, all of the minerals were known, they knew the proteins, they knew the carbs, they knew the lipids and the minerals and so forth like that. The only problem is they didn't know how they worked. They knew they were there, but they didn't know how they actually worked. So from 1940 up to about 1989, we call they describe this as being the biochemical function era. And so this is the era where they actually try to determine, well, exactly what do these nutrients do? Um, really came about in the 1940s. A lot of money was poured into nutrition research because of World War II. As I understand it, about 1/3 of the men who volunteered for service in World War II were turned away. They didn't pass the physical. They were very malnourished. So this brought up a big concern. And so they started doing lots of nutrition surveys around the country to see how people were actually eating, what was going on in these communities. And they actually also looked at food preparation and looked at see if high heat would affect any of these nutrients. But the main thing that came out, the main idea of this was to try to get more men to be able to serve, and then also looking at the service people who are actually fighting the war. How do we keep them healthy? Because they were out using these this nutrition packs that they would carry with them, um, and they wanted to make sure that they were packaged properly, so they looked at packaging. They wanted to make sure that they would have enough nutrients, and so a lot of money was spent in the early 1940s on nutrition research. Out of that 1940s came the first RDAs. The RDAs have been around since the 1940s. Now they're kind of incorporated into what we call the DRIs, but the RDAs were put together in the 1940s basically to inform the public about how many nutrients they should have. So the RDAs basically are a set of guidelines that list how much vitamin A you should have, how much vitamin C, how much iron, so forth and so on, based on age groups, based on male, female, sex, based on whether you're pregnant, whether you're lactating, that kind of thing. So they started putting this information together based on data that they had at that time. Now the RDAs change about every 5 years. It kind of varies, but as they get more and more research data, and it still happens today, as they get more and more research data, they change the numbers about every 5 years. So they're a lot different today than they were in the 1940s. In looking at that. Also, the basic 7 food groups came out of that. This was the first introduction to, well, you need to get so much of this group and this group and this group, and we'll go over those groups here in a bit and look at what were the first 7 basic 7 food groups. Then, so that happens in the 40s and in the 50s and so forth. And then in the 1960s, they started looking at malnutrition. In the past, and again in the 1930s, and the Depression was in the late 20s, early 30s, and into the 40s kind of thing, and that's why a lot of individuals were malnourished. But what they started so sorry, I keep remembering things I should be saying. Back in the 40s, they were looking at malnutrition based on deficiencies. But in the 1960s, what they started noticing was overnutrition. Most of you weren't alive, or I'm sure probably all of you were not alive in the 1950s, and I was just a small little kid. I was just born. But that was a big era. Those 10 years of the 1950s were an amazing era for this country. A lot of income, both mom and dads and spouses were working, a lot of money was coming in, people were able to afford things, so they started eating what they would consider better, higher, basically higher calorie foods, richer meats, high fat meats, and that kind of thing. And so by the 1960s, there was being noticed that um, there was a lot of malnutrition on the other end of the spectrum. A lot of people were becoming overweight, which you hadn't seen, earlier in the century. Um, I actually remember, in the 1960s when fast food became a big deal. I remember hearing about the first McDonald's in Spokane, Washington, when I was going to Washington State University. Well, that was in 1970, and it actually came about by the late 1960s. Um, about 1968 or 9 or so, when they first put the first McDonald's, and people would drive from Pullman 90 miles to Spokane to go to a McDonald's to get a Big Mac. So back in the 60s is when fast foods really started to get a foothold in society, because people had a lot of money, they didn't want to spend time cooking, and fast foods, and there was no information basically that fast foods are good, bad, or ugly. But they started seeing a change. Then in the 1970s, they started looking at what what is called bioavailability, and what that means is, sure, we can do research and we can say, let's just look at a carrot. We can look at a carrot and say, ooh, it has a lot of nutrients in it. The problem is a lot of nutrients are wasted when you eat a carrot, especially raw, because we don't digest it as well as if it was actually cooked. There are some vegetables that are better absorbed or better broken down if they're cooked, because you soften the cell wall a little bit. So cooking carrots is sometimes more nutritious than eating it raw, even though eating it raw is still good. Uh, but what they started looking at is, well, okay, we've got all these nutrients, we know they're in foods, but are people actually getting them when they eat them? So they did a lot of research on having people eat food, and then they would know what the nutrient content was going in, and then they would check fecal material going out, and they would determine, well, they were only getting 25% of the nutrients available, and so that might not be very, very bioavailable to individuals. So they started looking at that to see if there could be something that could uh, have people absorbing better. 1980s, basically, they started tying in diet and health relationship. Actually, in the 1977 was the first year that the public really heard the word cholesterol. Cholesterol wasn't even a word in the 60s, well, before 1977. Nobody had a clue. That wasn't even a word in anybody's vocabulary except researchers. And the idea of saturated fat and that kind of thing came out in the late 70s. Well, in the 80s, they started looking at, well, what is the relationship of cholesterol to health? What is the relationship of fiber to health, and that kind of thing? And started tying in um, how nutrients affected health, and that kind of thing. And there was a lot of um, research on athletic performance during that time. If you're an athlete, a lot of research done at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado, with how do nutrients affect nutrition or athletic performance. So there's a lot of information on that. So they're really looking at the types of nutrients and how they affect health, and that kind of thing. I remember in the 1986 is when marketing for nutrients really became a big thing. Um, and Quaker Oats, I should mention that, but an oat company actually came out with how high fiber foods can affect health, and they put that on their advertising that oatmeal can reduce cholesterol and that kind of thing, and they made a lot of money. I think their profits went up 600% or something like that. Well, they can't do that because they made the statement basically that oatmeal will reduce cholesterol, and they had to stop doing that because now you hear, well, it can help or it can possibly reduce the risk, but they don't use the word will because it doesn't work for everyone. But marketing and foods with nutrient labels on them, nutrition information on there, saying that this had an effect on cancer or heart disease or osteoporosis, high calcium kind of thing, really came out in the middle 1980s, and well, today we see it today. So with that information from the 1980s, basically it went into the 1990s, where we basically now had enough information. The researchers felt that we could actually make recommendations about intakes that people should get. So they started looking and making recommendations to the public about, well, you should reduce your saturated fat and increase unsaturated fat. You should be getting this much fiber. You should be getting this much sodium. So there's a lot of nutrients that really were not vitamins or minerals or kind of thing, even though sodium is, but didn't tie it into hypertension. So these recommendations were based on health and not just maintaining health, but reducing the risk of getting a specific disease. So saturated, unsaturated would be heart disease, fiber for colorectal cancer, sodium for hypertension. So they really started coming out with recommendations based on the information they got from the 80s, and again, it continues today. So the 1990s was the preventative nutrition era, where they started releasing data that people should follow to prevent disease, that kind of thing. In the 2000s, and at this point, we're in what's called the Nutrigenomics era. As you know, everything's based on genetics, and so nutrition in relationship to genetics, basically how do nutrients affect the expression of a gene, and they were looking at that. So it's called nutrigenomics, and we're still in that. I haven't seen a new name for an era since the 2000s, but this is basically where we're at. Everything is genetics. And so we're just at the point in nutrigenomics, we're probably in maybe the late 40s, early 50s, where we basically know the nutrients that are affecting genetic expression, but we're still trying to do the idea of well, exactly what expression is it, more of it will that affect expression better, worse, or less of it, that kind of thing. It won't be too long till we're in the 90s where you may see within your lifetime and maybe mine, we will see recommendations to take this specific nutrient to increase genetic expression. And some of you that had some genetics, I don't know if in your past you've heard of epigenetics, but epigenetics is beyond the human genome, but it affects what we call expression of a phenotype, and that's directly affected by nutrients and can increase or decrease some issues with phenotype. So anyway, here's some of the 5 tenets. I don't really expect you to remember these 5 tenets, but the 5 tenets of nutrigenomics are diet can be a serious factor. Dietary chemicals alter gene expression. So different things, even toxic things, can alter gene expression. Diet can influence genetic makeup and also expression. Diet-regulated genes, dietary intervention based on genotype can. So you're going to see a lot more information about getting a genetic profile. I mean, the whole future of medicine is going to be individual medicine. You get a genetic profile, and they will prescribe medications, they will prescribe nutrients, and that based on your genetic profile. And you can do that in some sense today, but I would expect in 10 years that's going to be a common practice, is that one of your screenings when you get um, screened into the hospital, that you will get a genetic profile. There will have one already in your record, and then they can base pharmacies and pharmaceuticals and stuff, nutrients based on your genetic profile. Because you know as well as I do, there can be two people, they can get the same medication, it doesn't work for one, works for the other. Same thing with diets. Sometimes you have a disease, even like diabetes, and some people respond well, some people don't. But it's all based on genetics, and so genetic profile is going to play a big role in the future of medicine, which is why if you're going into healthcare, you should really get real comfortable with genetics and how it works and that kind of thing. Just kind of looking through some of the symbols as we go through the history. This is the symbol that was used for the basic 7, and you can see what the basic 7 amounted to as you see this list of 7 things. So that was done in 1943, again coming out of World War II, and looking at that. 1954 they changed it a little bit, and so that people could use their hands. And it's kind of blurry because this is the best picture I could get, but basically the 5 food groups are fruits, vegetables, meat, eggs, milk and cheese, bread and butter. You know, those kinds of things are part of the 5 fingers to nutrition. The basic 4 was probably what your grandma grew up with in school. They used to teach the basic 4 as part of their nutrition program for little kids. It is still pretty valid. The only problem that came out of the basic 4 was they didn't look at nutrient density, and we'll look at nutrient density later, but basically it's how many nutrients per calorie. So for example, a piece of whole wheat bread would be 1 serving, but also a donut would be 1 serving. If you look at meat, ribs would be a serving, but also round steak. And round steak is a lot less fat. It's about 32% calories from fat, and ribs are up in the 50s or 60s percent calories from fat. So there's a lot of variation and confusion about, well, what do we mean by bread? If you would include nutrient density in there, again, skim milk, low-fat meats, fruits and vegetables without butter or something added to them, cereals and breads that are whole grain and that kind of, this is a perfect thing to follow. It still works. It's just you need to add that nutrient density piece. Then the food pyramid in 1992. Again, there were some issues with this because if you look at if you look at the different the purpose of this, sorry for that coming up, but the purpose of this was the amount of space in the pyramid should reflect how much it should be part of your diet. If you look at the bottom, the bread and cereal group was supposed to be the most. It's not anymore. And the other issue with it is that they didn't really differentiate between refined like white bread, white rice versus whole grain stuff. So most people would choose white rice and white bread and that kind of thing, which wasn't good. And then you can see that there's fat symbols in there. If you look up at the right, the key, the fat are there, yellow circles and that kind of thing. The other controversy with the vegetable group has a fat in it, and that reflects that they would say, well, some people add butter to the vegetables or they add dressing or something like that. And then if you look at the meat and poultry, there's a lot of difference between meat, poultry, and dry beans or nuts. Dry beans, should be down in its own category along with vegetables and stuff, because what it's saying is you should not, you should limit your dry beans, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So there was some controversy about the whole deal, but the picture, it was made as a visual for people who can't read. There's still a lot of people in this country who can't read. So it was a good visual for looking for people who couldn't read. They could kind of see the symbols and that kind of thing. So overall it was good, but there was just some controversy about that it didn't meet the needs. Now, what they were thinking with this one, I have no clue. I don't know anybody that can understand this one, except the only positive things, they have a person running up, and so exercise was part of the deal. But this is ridiculous. I don't know how anybody can get anything out of those stripes. I have no idea what they were thinking. It's kind of like, you know, a committee's idea of drawing a horse and they end up with a camel or something. Anyway, it's not good. So that went away. Now we're in the Choose My Plate thing that came out in 2011, which again is a good picture, pictorial of things, fruits, vegetables, grains, proteins, and what it reflects is that fruits and vegetables should take up 50% of your plate. You should have protein just for enjoyment, grains, you know, for enjoyment. But again, brown should reflect whole grains. The color of the fruits and vegetables means you're eating to color. A little bit of protein and dairy, a little bit of dairy should be included in that. So it's a good. I think people like it. I mean, it makes sense without having to read a bunch of stuff, that kind of thing. What's next? I would guess that something dealing with genetics would be the next piece that we would go to. Now, when it's going to come that direction, I don't know. But personalized nutrition is going to be the next piece of this whole puzzle. Looking at precision nutrition, eat what you need. Do not expect simple solutions like pills. And so you need to change your behaviors. But I believe the next plate or whatever design they come up with is going to reflect a genetics component to what we should be eating. So it's going to become, it's kind of like in the late 1900s when cholesterol came out, people would go to the store and you could even go like Safeway or anywhere and get your blood drawn, and they would check total cholesterol. And if you're over 200, basically you would freak because you were going to die. But now, as you know, if you've ever had a blood test, they're more precise in that they do not only total cholesterol, but LDLs, HDLs, VLDLs, those. So it becomes more and more specific. And even later, they're going to get even more specific than that because as we'll see later on, there are different sizes of LDLs. And so the small ones are worse than the big ones, kind of thing. It's going to be the same exact thing, is that we're going to look at fruits and vegetables, but we're going to differentiate based on your personal nutrition, which ones would be best for you. Okay, kind of thing. So again, that's the history of nutrition, but it all boils down to, again, if you wanted to use a better plate than we have now, is don't eat processed crap and juice and sugar. So summary of the story is, we talked about it in the first session. We all know what to eat. We just need to want to. But if you can go by my plate right now, it's about the best that we have, and you'll be doing great. So we'll talk to you next time.